So this morning, I want to talk to us, since it's, the story on Matthew is about being alert, and especially when the master's away, the vicar's away, so she could come back at any time, but I don't think she'll be coming back this morning somehow, so we should be all right. But this morning, I want us to think about, how much time people in churches worry about things that we don't need to worry about. Or discuss things that really we shouldn't be discussing. Or assuming things that really we don't know anything about. I wonder how much church time or how many church meetings all over the world and throughout history spent precious time arguing or trying to agree on issues that were really quite irrelevant. Now, I know that this hasn't happened here in this church, but have you ever been to a church meeting and thought, that was a waste of time? That hasn't happened here though, has it? Of course not. And I wonder how many tears and fights and hurt feelings and misunderstandings there have been all over the centuries from people in churches focusing on things they really didn't need to. Or in all honesty, they shouldn't have. Now, I know this church would never be like that, arguing over petty things. Of course. And I wonder how much time, money and resources were wasted throughout the ages by churches and on programs or projects that in the end were basically pointless. I think if there is one thing the church struggles with most, it is focusing on the right things and letting go of things we don't need to focus on. Getting worked up over some things and neglecting far more important things. And I wonder how many people have left the church because it didn't really focus on things that were actually good for people. People came to church and they felt judged and condemned rather than encouraged or affirmed. It's said, and I don't know if you'll believe this or not, but some people have said that church is boring. Can you believe that? Of course, you would never have said that. That church isn't a life-giving place, apparently. And I wonder if that is because churches have lost their focus in bringing the good news to society. And the question I want to know is if we as a church are still lost. Now, I want you to think about what I'm going to say. You may agree or you may disagree. It's totally up to you. In churches throughout the world today, many Christians don't actually hold much regard for the Pharisees, do they, in the Bible? Because Jesus gave them a hard time. Woe to you, Pharisees, teachers of religious law. And we can easily see them as misguided religious bigots. We easily see them as missing the point of God's word, don't we? Okay, I'm not setting you up too much. But have you considered this? Around 800 years before Jesus arrived, Israel was doing pretty well as a little country in the back blocks. There was wealth for the upper and middle classes. They believed that the way they were living was being blessed by God because life was good for many people. They had extra money to buy things they didn't need. And sure, they did dabble in worshipping other gods, but the other gods were connected to horticulture, to the rain. And if the rains didn't come, they were in real trouble. And so it didn't matter just to, hedge your bets a little bit, as they did. And it showed that it worked because they were prospering pretty well. It seemed to be working. The economy was purring along. And they went and they did their temple worship and they brought their sacrifices religiously. And yet we know in hindsight that they were heading for destruction, don't we? The prophets talked about, and we have it all throughout the Old Testament, of their treatment of the vulnerable people. They talked about to obey is better than sacrifice. And Israel ended up in exile. And this is where the Pharisees come in after exile. When they returned to Jerusalem and their ruined temple, Israel had figured out, it only took them 70, 80, 90 years, not too long to work it out. I mean, they had to lose everything in the process. But they worked out to obey is better than sacrifice. And so you have a book like Ezra in the Bible. Ezra is seen as perhaps the first Pharisee who really seriously began to focus on the law, because to obey is better than sacrifice. And you read throughout Ezra his focus on obeying the Torah. It's all important. Because that's what the prophets said. They got it after 70, 80, 90 years. And so the Pharisees were focused on the law, keeping the law, like the prophets told them, because to obey is better than sacrifice. And the law became all important. It became their lifeline to God. It became the way that they knew that they were right before God. It was their confidence in their faith, because they knew the law and they obeyed the law. They needed the law. The problem is that by Jesus' time, the Pharisees and teachers of religious law, not all but many, were deluded and became just as bad as the people in the 8th century. Their lives were pretty good superficially, even under the Roman rule, because they had quite a bit of wealth, as we see in the Gospels. The Roman rule allowed them to prosper, but again, we see that even though they were educated and they were respectable and religious people, they had become deluded in God's sight. Even though they were focused on the law, they were still able to neglect the poor and live a life that Jesus strongly spoke against. It seems that they were focusing on the wrong things, discussing things that weren't good, and worrying about issues that were in God's sight pointless. And the question I want to ask us today as a church, and it's a serious question, is if we are susceptible of being in the same position as the Pharisees in Jesus' time, or Israel in the 8th century. Because we are wealthy, we have excess. I mean, there would be real concern if we didn't have more than enough for our daily bread, even though that's what we pray, give us our daily bread. But if we didn't have enough food for Monday, we'd start to worry, wouldn't we? Especially if it's a holiday and no shops were open. And this church, like many others throughout New Zealand, is typical of the church, white, middle class. And yet we know that in New Zealand there are reports of people living in the poverty line. And although we know that there are churches and there are agencies that do help, how much are we really doing? Or what about the lonely, the shut-ins, those falling through the health services or other government services? Are these things, or these people, taking up most of our time and resources? Or do other things What captures our attention? What do our synods and vestry meetings build up steam over? Doesn't seem to be this sort of thing. I know that because I just went to our synod meeting. There wasn't anything like that there. Talked about church growth and mission. Bums on pews, and we're not really doing a great job there, even though we've talked about it for the last 10 so years. What things really get our goat? What things really steams us up? What takes up our time at church meetings, bishop meetings? You don't want to know what clergy talk about at their meetings. Not very interesting at all, really. I know I'm there. Sometimes I wish I wasn't. In our gospel reading this morning in Mark 13, we have this difficult passage of Jesus foretelling future events. But he isn't really, I don't think he's really actually talking about future events. What Jesus is really saying is for us to be focused on the more important things and to let go of those things that keep us from serving God. Because in the chapter before Mark 13, Jesus talks about the greatest commandment, which is to love God and to love others as we love ourselves. And then Jesus warns his disciples of the deluded teachers of religious law because of their lack of love. I mean, they know the law, but they don't know how to love, especially the vulnerable. They're probably quite good at loving themselves. Then there's this short story account of Jesus seeing the widow who gives a few cents, all she had, and how that meant far more to God than those rich people who gave a tiny part of their surplus wealth. And this leads to chapter 13 and the future-focused delusion, as I put it. Because Jesus says it's not about looking to the future events and getting sidetracked with predicting things. You know, was Hitler the Antichrist, or Saddam Hussein, wasn't he meant to be the Antichrist? Who is it now? People got really carried away with it a few years ago. Was these the last days? Rather, Jesus says the most important thing is to be like the faithful servant who is waiting for his master to return and doing their jobs faithfully and not falling asleep. Falling asleep like the disciples did in the Garden of Gethsemane. They couldn't stay awake. The point Jesus is making is that no one knows when Christ will return. Not even the angels in heaven. And I sort of had this picture of the angels in heaven walking around wondering, is this the week we're going to go? Oh, I'm getting a bit worried. When do you think we're going to go? I thought we were going to go soon. I'm not sure when we need to go. I thought it was going to be last month, but that didn't happen. Do you think the angels are having that sort of conversation? They could have been having meetings about it. Or do you think that they're simply focused on serving God as best they can? Focusing on the things that they're responsible for. Matthew 13 ends with, be on guard, stay alert, and some other translations add, and pray. Be on guard, stay alert, and pray. Be ready to serve God in any way we can. Be alert, don't let us lose our focus, because that is so important. That is so easy for us to do. What are the big things, the big focuses of our life? What things do we focus on the most in our life today? What things do we fight over or not fight for? that perhaps we should? How do we actually ensure that we are on the right track and we're not heading for destruction? Because we don't want to be in the same boat as Israel before the exile or the Pharisees in Jesus' time, do we? I don't think so. Because both groups were doing well materially, both were educated, both were empowered to live pretty much as they chose. Both were religious and pious, they were publicly acceptable, and they were even admired. The problem is that they were wrong in God's sight. I simply want us, and I speak to myself just as much as I've been speaking to people this morning, that we don't fall into the same trap as others before us. Because there's no reason why this can't happen to us. We need to be so careful in our faith because history shows how easy it is for even the most dedicated, zealous, devoted people to lose their way. To firmly think that they're on God's side when in fact they've wandered from God. And I was thinking as I was preparing this sermon, how we know if we really are on the right track or if we are really serving God or if we're going off track. And I looked at sort of a theme between the 8th century Israel and the Pharisees and today. And one thing that sort of came to mind is fear. Do we fear God? They knew the right words to say. They knew how to act in public. They knew what sounded good. But underneath, did they truly fear God? Did their lives reflect this fear? Now, this isn't a fear that paralyses us, like if a lion happened to walk into the building. But it's a fear of incredible awe and reverence of this God who created all these things. Like the prayer we had this morning. The Benedictio of Aotearoa. This incredible awe of worshipping a God who has myriads and millions of angels and surrounding him, and even though we're few today, if we count up all the heavenly hosts, it wouldn't matter. This incredible God, do we truly fear? It is such an important question. Because it is a fear that says, do we truly serve God or are we actually serving ourselves? A fear that says serving God is far more important than serving ourselves, serving our comfort or our priorities, our securities, the things we want. God actually becoming an ends to a means to an end. We want God to do stuff for us. And so today I wonder if Christians in New Zealand truly fear God as we should. Or do we take and leave God as it pleases us? Thinking that God will take up our slackness, our apathy, our indifference in loving Him or loving others. The Bible clearly says that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and this wisdom is how we are to live this life. This wisdom is such a close attribute of God. It was there in the very beginning. Proverbs 8 talks about Psalm 8. This wisdom that is so closely connected with fear. And perhaps this is a question that should take up far more of our time than anything else as a church. Do we truly fear God, or has God become so common that it doesn't really matter? We can do what we like. It doesn't really matter if we neglect the vulnerable, the unseen in our society. Other people will do it. It's what my taxes do. I'm off the hook. Perhaps the way we know if we are on the right track is what we do spend our time focusing on in church meetings, vestry, bishops, synods, personally. As Micah said, this is Micah in the Bible, not Micah, the youth worker. O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. In the next passage it also adds, fear the Lord if you are wise. It's in Micah 6, verse 8. The Lord has told you what is good. You know what is good. And this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Fear the Lord if you are wise. Amen.